Welcome, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me to this class, Muslim Perspectives on Death and Dying. My name is Zeynep Sayılgan. I'm the Muslim scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies. So grateful that you made the time to join us for these 3 weeks, for these 3 class sessions. And maybe just a little bit about me. I'm the Muslim scholar at the Institute, focusing mainly on classes on Islamic studies. I was born and raised in Germany as a child of Kurdish Muslim immigrants, and was also fortunate to grow up in a very diverse Muslim community. There are around 5 million Muslims in Germany. And then 16 years ago, I came as a student to the United States and continued my work here with the local Muslim community, which again is a very diverse community. We are doing something countercultural. And I want to express my gratitude to you that for your commitment and for your courage to come to talk about a topic that sometimes seems like a taboo. Death is very much a stigma. It's sanitized in our society. It's not very much talked about. And I wanted to create, and we at the Institute wanted to create this intentional space where we can come together to talk about a topic, a difficult topic that is universal. Death is universal. We all know that. So it's not a niche topic. And it's something that concerns all of us, each of us. Many of you know that over a year ago, my little daughter, my 3-year-old daughter, Miriam, was killed in a car accident. And so I come to this topic not from a disinterested or disengaged perspective. I come to this subject as a Muslim scholar, as a devout, practicing Orthodox traditional Muslim, but also as a grieving mother. Some of you, many of you will remember that my last class was actually with Miriam. She was sitting with me here on my lap in this very room. That was my last class before she died that year in October. So her love still sustains me, but in the early weeks of my intense grief, I prayed to God that I not only want to survive this tragedy, but I also really want to grow and thrive with it and learn. So I really see this as a space for growth and learning, and I hope I can pull you with me together, that we really come to this and explore the topic around death and dying. And I bring my full personal self to this work. I've always seen it as an act of embodied pedagogy, that I bring myself and my professional life and my autobiography actually is merged together. And so I want people to lean into the discomfort, feel comfortable, and see me as a resource. And I want you to be comfortable asking questions, feel safe. Ask me also personal questions. If I can make your life and work in any way a little bit easier, then I think this course was worth it. And then I think also my own pain has meaning and purpose in some way. So I will always be a grieving mother until, according to my Muslim belief, I will see her again. Constant heartache and sweet sadness and a holy longing will always be part of my life. I have come to accept that. But I also think I really want to take this as a learning opportunity, as an opportunity for growth. And we all know that in this moment, in this painful moment of collective grief and sadness and trauma, that there is still so much to be learned. And I truly believe personally that even in the midst of tragedy, that there are always opportunities for growth and enlightenment and awakening and transformation. And so this is where I stand, and I hope I can, offer that kind of learning and guidance and be helpful to you in some ways. So we have, of course, also we have this wonderful opportunity. And before I actually go on, let me just say how grateful I am to be working with amazing colleagues who have been so supportive and so gracious and caring and compassionate throughout this very difficult time in my life and my family's life. And I want to just express my gratitude to them. And also, special shout out to my wonderful colleague, Katie, and all the people at our communications department who are working so hard in preparing the classes and courses and these wonderful slides. I'm so grateful to them. And I'm so grateful to this community, to the ICJS community. Many of you have expressed so much support. I've received so much kindness, love, and help from all of you. And again, I wanted to just also take a moment to say how grateful I am. I will never be able to somehow, return that love and the help and the kindness that I've received. And I wanted you to just know how grateful I am for all the wonderful support you have shown me throughout this tragedy. As we move on, you have this wonderful opportunity with Slido, even me as a not so tech savvy person. You can scan this QR code with your photo app and have the ability to submit questions throughout the course until tomorrow evening, I believe. You can also go to slido.com and then submit this number, type in this number, and all the input is anonymous, which is quite helpful because sometimes you feel a little bit, I personally always don't want to, sometimes not share any question because I feel a little bit, uncomfortable. But I think this is a nice way where we can engage and also invite your input and your questions and your comments and feedback and any lingering thought you have throughout these 3 weeks. And that gives me also the ability to address them throughout the 3 weeks. And I can also process your questions, and I will try my best to address them the best way I can. I don't see this as the end of a conversation on death and dying. I see it as a conversation starter, and hopefully, you can take this and also initiate conversations with others in your circle. So what is my vision for these 3 class sessions, for these 3 weeks? I mean, I really have very humble ambitions. So as noted, this class about Muslim perspectives on death and dying. So I hope that by the end of this course, you will be able to have some basic religious understanding on Muslim perspectives on death and dying, some basic religious literacy that is helpful to think about how do 2 billion Muslims around the world orient themselves around the reality of death and dying. And so that is, of course, our hope for this class, that you're able to come out with some basic understanding. And then how do these views inform Islamic practice? How does it inform Muslim life? Our views, our thoughts, our beliefs impact our conduct and behavior. And so as Muslims are affirming certain things, are affirming certain views on death and dying, how does that really play out in daily Muslim life? And the interreligious piece, this is where you come in, where you hopefully examine your own personal views on human mortality. Again, a universal theme. We all are facing our existential mortality. And also enhance your own view. Where do you stand? How do you compare? How do you, differ or agree or disagree with Muslim perspectives on death and dying? And I think that's where we will have some valuable conversation, and where I will invite you into some small group conversation. And I hope that you take this as an opportunity to be able to articulate your own views, and also maybe sometimes say, I really don't know yet, and I'll need to think about these things. This is the beauty of interreligious engagement, that sometimes the other invites us to clarify our own views and helps us to examine where we stand. In terms of our course outline for tonight, I think it's very important to look at the scriptural content, the Quran, which is the central authority for Muslims, and how the Quran portrays death, how the Quran talks about death. The Quran for Muslims is the first normative source for Muslim life. So the Quranic vocabulary, the Quranic portrayal, and the Quranic depiction on the themes of death and dying are critical in understanding Muslim perspectives, because Muslims are sustained by the Quranic content and the Quranic theology. In next week, or in the next class session, we will look at the second normative source in Islam, the second authority in Islam, or for Muslims. Muslim life is informed by the embodied practice of the Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad is affirmed in the Muslim tradition as the final and last messenger. And he is the example of perfect piety, an example of a human example and role model to emulate. And he comes to the experience of death and dying as a human being. How did the Prophet Muhammad talked about death? How did he dealt with death? So we will look at that second source of Muslim life, the embodied practice, and how Muslims are informed through the prophetic practice. And in our final class session, we will look at our particular context, the American context. What are some of the challenges that American Muslims are engaging with, are facing, as they are relating to the topic of death and dying? So this is our game plan for these next 3 sessions. And tonight, we will basically follow that outline. We will dive into a little bit of scriptural reading, again, a central authority for Muslims, as they're trying to understand and comprehend human mortality. And then we will go into small groups and then come back for the large group. Now, in this moment, maybe I'm also just curious who is in the room. If you could maybe, now that you see the Zoom poll, just feel free to share how you orient yourself. What's your religious or non-religious background, your spiritual background, your faith background, however you feel comfortable to describe yourself. How do you position yourself? It would be just helpful to see who is in the room. I'm just curious to see if we are creating an interreligious space here. So I see people are submitting their answers, 40 people, and we have a wonderful big crowd. There are like 130 people in the room. And we'll give it maybe, 50 more seconds. And like I said, this class is about the Muslim perspective, not the Muslim perspective, but Muslim perspectives on death and dying, because the Muslim community is not a monolith. It's a global population of 2 billion Muslims. The results are in, and we'll look at them. Now, like I said, we have currently 2 billion Muslims around the world, and they live in so many diverse contexts, geographical contexts. They come from very different linguistic contexts. They come from different cultural contexts, racial contexts, ethnic contexts. Like I said, I come from the Kurdish Muslim context, but my parents are from Turkey and then moved to Germany, which introduced me a very diverse community of 5 million Muslims. I have friends who are Bosnian Muslims, Afghan Muslims, Iranian Muslims, African American Muslims, you name it. So we know that there are, Muslims come from a very diverse background. Currently in the United States, we have around 4 to 5 million Muslims. And the American Muslim community is a very diverse community, racially diverse, linguistically diverse, ethnically diverse. Now, that does not mean, though, that we have a cacophony of voices when it comes to the theologies around death and dying. There's still a very important unity where we orient ourselves. We still have a focal point. We have a shared orientation. We have a common focal point, and this is just to demonstrate how that looks like. The Hajj season is almost upon us in June. Muslims all over the world will depart for the pilgrimage, the Hajj, to the sacred shrine, the Kaaba in Mecca. And it's the largest gathering of humankind in the history. Around 3 million Muslims from around the world are coming to this place over a period of 4 days to reenact the Abrahamic rites, but it's also reenactment of Judgment Day, when all the pilgrims at the end of the Hajj, of the pilgrimage, are gathering at the Mount of Arafat to ask for forgiveness and to reconcile. So what I'm saying is, while there is a huge diversity of Muslims around the world, there is still a very important unified shared religious language, a shared orientation. And we turn to the Kaaba, we turn to the Quran and our beliefs in the one God and the final prophecy of the Prophet Muhammad. These are all things and sources where we orient ourselves. And that also had created a shared religious language, a shared religious unified worldview on things and orientation. That's still very important. So tonight, as we look at the first major source for Muslim life, it's very important that the Quran for Muslims is a central authority. And Muslims around the world will always say, God says in the Quran, God says. And that is for Muslims literally the word of God. So when they refer to the Quran, it's God's speech, which is called in Quranic language Kalamullah. And Kalamullah, the word of God, is the eternal word of God. While Muslims affirm that this is the revelation of God, that has always still invited reason and interpretation. And Muslims approached the revelation with reason. And there was a marriage of revelation and reason throughout the 1500 years of Muslim history. So that means we have a huge tradition of Muslim commentary, of exegetical literature, and a richness of Muslim voices trying to understand what the word of God means. But it's very important that the Quran that is recited in Texas, in the United States, recited here in Maryland, or in Mainz, in my hometown in Germany, or in Turkey, or in Pakistan, or Afghanistan, or in Jerusalem, is still the same very Quranic Arabic, the same formal Quranic Arabic, the same text that was recited 1500 years ago. That is really important to mention. So again, a shared, unified orientation. As Muslims are trying to understand the reality of death and dying, they first look what God says in the Quran about death and dying. Now, this is the first source that we will turn to tonight. And then we will look next week at the second normative source for Muslim life, the Sunnah, which are the teachings and the life of Prophet Muhammad, his sayings and actions and silent approvals that are codified in the written hadith collections. But I'll say more to that next week. So for tonight, I'm curious, as you reflect on death and dying, what is one thing that is lingering on your mind? And again, like I said, you take your phone and then scan the QR code. You can also go to slido.com and type in the number and then submit your answers. But this also helps me to address your questions, your thoughts as you are thinking about this universal reality of death and dying. And like I said, I will try my best to address it as I'm walking through the course. And it also gives me time to think about it a little bit, because we have a good number of people. So they already, yes, good questions coming in. Questions about the afterlife. Is there to be a judgment day? What happens after death? What are the burial rituals? Wonderful, wonderful questions. Yes, we have a lot of healthcare people in the room, chaplains who are trying to serve Muslim patients, or they're trying to offer care and support to Muslim clients, Muslim patients. So this is also, of course, a question that is important as we are working in the healthcare sector in hospice. We live in a diverse society. We can't afford anymore to not know about what other religious communities believe and how every individual comes to the question of death and dying. So these are really pertinent questions. These are wonderful thoughts. We have people who ask about what words of sympathy are appropriate. We'll touch upon, bereavement and grief support, because oftentimes people tell me, I don't know what to say, how to support a grieving person. What are things that are helpful? And in my own experience with grief, which is one word, but it has so many, heavy emotions, right? I'm just taking mental notes as I'm experiencing my own grief, and I also try to share that with the larger audience and with my own community. But there is still a lot of education necessary. And I talked about the course goal. I think when we live in such a global village, is this just critically important to have basic religious literacy about what 2 billion Muslims around the world think and how they orient themselves around death and dying, and vice versa. For everyone who calls himself a global citizen, I think it's just necessary that we, engage and become more skilled, have a better knowledge about religious diversity. So these are very good questions. I see keywords like cremation, what happens after death, and judgment, and then there is infant death. There's, very interesting words. We will definitely collect all of those. And like I said, I will make sure that I, try to address them as we move on. So let me now take you to a little bit of a scriptural reading and walk you through some of the verses in the Quran that have helped Muslims to develop a robust theology on death and dying. And because the Quran is so clear and consistent and coherent on the topic of death and dying, what emerges is a very clear picture. And especially in my own experience with Muslims, diverse Muslims from Germany and the United States and in Turkey, in my own grief experience, I have always heard the Quranic passages echoed in the mouth and minds of Muslims as they came to offer me support and came. So I would definitely, as I was, reading these passages of the Quran, so many things that Muslims said to me throughout this year, after the tragedy of my daughter, after the death of my daughter, it just echoed the Quranic content. So I wanted you to also walk with me through these very important passages, so you have a little bit of a basic overview of the Quranic content on theology, on death and dying. And like I said, for Muslims, it is divine authority that speaks. These are the words of God, quite literally, as an ontological reality. So they're taken very seriously. and also guides Muslims in their approach to death and dying. Now, the Quran makes a claim that it knows humanity and talks about humanity a lot. And one of the important themes that is throughout echoed in the Quran, that human beings are definitely afraid of death, acknowledging that fear of death is real, is human, and also claiming that human beings are trying to deny the reality of death, that human beings try to escape the reality of death by any, in any way they can. And I think if we just look around us in our current culture and modern culture, there's definitely the messaging that death needs to be delayed. If you look at the anti-aging and all the anti-aging workout and all the books that talk about longevity, you definitely receive the message that death should be avoided or, delayed by any cost. And this is not to say that the Quran glorifies death, but it acknowledges there's an intrinsic fear of human beings, that fear of death is very human and is also natural. So just to ease that a little bit, the Quran is very aware that human beings don't want to die and actually have a huge and strong yearning for eternity and immortality. And what is beautiful in the creation story, the creation narrative, when the Quran talks about the creation of Adam and Eve, the first human beings, there are passages that refer how Adam, Prophet Adam, who's considered to be a prophet in the Islamic tradition, was tempted by Satan to eat from the forbidden tree. And it's interesting that Satan tells Adam that God has forbidden Adam to approach this tree because it would prevent him to become immortal or angels. And so this is also echoed in another passage. But Satan whispered to him, saying, "O Adam, shall I show you the tree of immortality and a kingdom that does not fade away?" So Adam is afraid. He doesn't want to die. He doesn't want to leave paradise and all the beautiful blessings and that heavenly home. And he's yearning for eternity. He wants to stay there forever. And so what the Quran is trying to convey is that human beings have a natural yearning for eternity, a natural yearning for immortality, and that human beings are not destined to die, but they are destined to live. And life is actually central in the Quranic discourse. But the problem arises that human beings, according to the Quran, are trying to satisfy their yearning for immortality in this world. So all our anti-aging culture and all our workout and gym exercises and all of that is trying to become somehow immortal in this world. So the criticism the Quran makes is that we are trying to satisfy our need for immortality in this world, in this earth, which by nature is impermanent and fragile and transitory. So the direction seems to be a bit off. And I think the Quran very much wants to affirm it's okay to be afraid of death, because your urfather, Prophet Adam, was afraid of dying. And it's absolutely all right to have a natural fear of death. And so fear in moderation is healthy, but if it becomes debilitating, if death anxiety to a degree that it prevents the human being to engage in any daily activity, then it becomes, of course, life threatening. So a little bit healthy fear in moderate doses is welcomed according to the Quranic understanding, but too much of fear of death becomes debilitating and paralyzing. So I think it's interesting that the Quran acknowledges that fear of death is intrinsic to the human nature, And human beings are not destined to die, because one of the major themes of the Quran is the afterlife and the resurrection of the body and the soul. But what the mistake is, according to the Quran, is that human beings are trying to find immortality in this finite place. So let's move on. We need to situate death into the framework of the Quran, how the Quran views life in this world. What's the purpose of this worldly life? And that helps us to have a better understanding how to position death into this divine framework. So according to the Quran, life is a sacred divine trust. So that by that very definition, the human beings have no claim, cannot make any claim of ownership, because life is Muslims don't usually avoid saying life is a gift, because a gift somehow conveys that it's now yours. What is often used in Muslim language is that life is a divine trust, an amana, that needs to be returned to God. So that basically my body, my children, my wealth, my property, my health, my feelings, my skills, my emotions, my entire life is not my own. I have responsibility to take care of it because it is entrusted to me, this life, and I will have to return it to the life giver. In this case, in the Quranic context, is God, right? Now, why is this important? Because God is the one who gives life according to the Quran, and God is the one who can take it back. And no human being has a claim of ownership, and no human being can question God why he wants his trust returned at a certain time. This is a very important idea to keep in mind. Another purpose that the Quran says of this world is not all what there is. There's another dimension, a dimension that is unseen, a dimension that is not known, a dimension that is invisible, which is the afterlife. So while there is this material and earthly place, there's also the otherworldly reality. And why are human beings in this world? To gain a sacred knowledge, to gain greater consciousness and awareness of God. But how do you come to a greater understanding of God and a sacred knowledge and consciousness of God? What does that even mean? The Quran always says, we want you to be more conscious of God. We want you to be more conscious of God, more aware of God. Taqwa is the Quranic term for that. Taqwa, to gain greater consciousness. Now, death is also situated in that Quranic framework. So when somebody, for example, experiences mortality, and we'll come to this, or death, there's a greater awareness of God as being the source of life, because now if you've experienced, mortality. So by experiencing mortality, it also leads to a greater understanding and sacred knowledge of God, who is the source of life. When we experience separation, we have a greater awareness and sacred knowledge and consciousness of God being the one who is eternal and he reunites us with our loved ones. When we experience pain and illness, we have a greater awareness and consciousness of God being the healer. When we experience hunger, we experience God as the sustainer, nourisher, and provider. So you see how in the Quran, this place is seen, or the earth, this life, is seen also through the opposites of experiences as a greater awareness of God. And in that context, the Quran introduces this world as a place of learning. The moment we are born as children into this world, we learn, we gain knowledge. We are constantly, learn names, ABCs. We try to strive, get an education, grow in our knowledge. But for the Quran, the most important thing is to gain spiritual growth and spiritual maturation. And so in that context, also, this world is seen as a place of examination, a place of trials and hardship to bring out the best of human potential. But just because Muslims affirm, according to the Quran, a belief in the afterlife, that doesn't mean this world is not important. This world is particularly important because you are investing in the hereafter. Every second counts. The worldly life is so precious because the Quran says it's a plowing field for the hereafter. Life is very limited. Time is a limited resource. Health is a limited resource. Knowledge is even a limited resource. If, God forbid, dementia, Alzheimer hits, then even that knowledge you realize is a very limited resource. All of this, through mortality, we realize that life is so precious, the time we have is so precious, and that then leads to a greater appreciation of this worldly life, because there's this, understanding that all my resources, all the skills, all the faculties, all what I have, my health, my beauty, my energy, all of that is limited, right? Because for a limited time, right? And this is primarily why mortality is placed in this Quranic framework. So the Quran doesn't regard death as death or illness or separation or pain as evil as such, because there is a potential that a calamity, and this is a very famous quote from one of the famous scholars in the Islamic tradition, from Ibn Taymiyyah, a calamity that makes you turn to God. Allah is the Arabic word for God. A calamity that makes you turn to come to God is better for you than a blessing which makes you forget the remembrance of God. So there's a potential that somebody in illness, in pain, in separation, through death, comes closer to the divine. And that in itself is a beautiful outcome, because the intimacy, the nearness to God is attained. Whereas sometimes a blessing, like health is a blessing. But if somebody wastes it on useless things, or, doing heedless stuff, or just distracts themselves constantly, then it also becomes not a blessing, and because it leads away from the remembrance of God and that nearness. So I think the idea of what is evil and what is bad in the Quranic context here is destabilized, because anything that brings a human being closer to God is beautiful. That's the very definition of goodness. There are some other passages that are quite interesting, I think, to understand Muslim perspectives on death. So first of all, there's this very important passage in the Quran that talks about the fact that death is a creation of God. Death is a creation of God. And this is from chapter 67, verse 2, which Muslims traditionally, from Surah Al-Mulk, chapter Mulk, recite before they go to bed. It's a very strong tradition. And the very second verse says, God is the one who created death and life to test you as to which of you is best indeed, and he is exalted in might of forgiving. It's a very provoking passage. By definition, if death is a creation of God, then by default, death cannot be nothing. Death cannot be meaningless. Death cannot be without purpose. Death cannot be with wisdom, because if you think of a creation, if you think of a piece of art, you think that the artist has thought about why he wants to create something. So what's the purpose of creating that piece of art? Then there is a design involved, a planning involved, an alignment involved, a wisdom involved, a will involved, a power involved, also beauty involved, meaning involved. So the Quran really challenges this perspective, saying, death is not just an accident. Death is not random. Death is not a punishment. Quite contrary, death is by design, by divine design, and it's a creation. It is, and the word that is used in the original is khalaqa, which when you look at an Arabic Quranic Arabic dictionary, means that it was created without a model. So mortality was divinely designed, human mortality was willed, and was put purposefully into the world. Human mortality is by God's design, is a creation, which is a very significant concept we need to keep in mind, and also challenging our notion that that people might think of death as an accident, random, it just happens, it's chaotic. And on the surface, it does look like that, right? I mean, I speak from experience. Death is destruction. Death is tragedy. Death is traumatic. Death is horrific. Death is chaos, confusion. Death is distress, right? But here we are presented with the notion that God says, according to Muslim belief, that it's a creation. It's part of the divine plan to put mortality into the world and to test the human being through mortality to come to their full potential. And there's another verse that says here, how can you deny God? You were lifeless and he gave you life. Then he caused you to die and again bring you to life, and then to him you will all be returned. So it's basically responding to the early community who challenged Prophet Muhammad, saying, how can we come back to life? We're dead, like the bones are dead. There's nothing to bring back. And the Quran uses a rhetorical device here to challenge that kind of objection and saying, you were lifeless before, right? You were nothing. You were a drop of sperm, lifeless matter. And in reality, if we look at the human being, the creation of a human, it's lifeless matter first, right? I mean, I had the privilege of being 3 times pregnant, and you realize it's just a lump of cell first, lifeless matter, and all of a sudden you're 8 weeks pregnant and there is a heartbeat. There start to be consciousness coming in and feeling and emotion, and all of a sudden out of lifeless matter, there's life. So that in itself, the Quran always drives back those opponents to the first creation and says, you were lifeless before and I gave you life. I gave you consciousness. I gave you feelings. I gave you an intellect. So how can you deny you denying your first creation, but you're unwilling, you're willing, you're accepting your first creation, but you're denying your second resurrection. So these are the type of dialogues and debates that the Quran makes with those objections. Quite interesting. Another thing that is often a refrain in the Quran is death is a natural part of life. Right now we are in the season of spring. We just experienced, the season of spring, and the Quran always points to the book of the universe, calls it the book of the universe, to think about the great resurrection and the afterlife. So here's again a case in point. Look then at the signs of God's mercy, how he gives life to the earth after its death. Most surely he will raise the dead to life, and he has power over all things. It's very clear. So the Quran responds to those who reject the human resurrection to say, look around you. The earth is being resurrected constantly. Life is returning back, and it's going to be the same case with human beings. They are not outside of this divine framework. Here's another verse that reiterates the same point. He is the one who sends the winds, ushering in his mercy. When the heavy clouds, I can't see, just put this a little bit. When they bear heavy clouds, we drive them to a lifeless land and then cause rain to fall, producing every type of fruit. Similarly, we will bring the dead to life, so perhaps you will be mindful. So again, a very strong theme in the Quran, which Muslims around the world throughout their history have strongly affirmed, is the belief in the resurrection and the afterlife, the resurrection of the body and the soul. One concept that's very interesting that is in the Quran, and I think I've read a little bit about lunar spirituality, and I like this kind of framing because it spoke to what the Quran is also talking about. So many times Islam is introduced as the religion of radical monotheism. And I think it's very interesting that you find this idea in the Quran that God is not compartmentalized. God is not showing up in the rosy and healthy and prosperous times in your life, but then he is taken away or absent in your moments of darkness and despair and sadness and pain and death and separation and illness and you name it. All these very difficult, tragic chapters in the human experience. Quite contrary, what you find in the Quran is introducing God as a God who is always present. He is the God of light and darkness. He is the God of joy and sadness. He is the God of sorrow and pleasure. He is the God of death and life. So it's very interesting that the Quran doesn't allow for that type of compartmentalization, because Muslims affirm radical tawheed. Tawheed means the oneness of God. And the oneness of God is affirmed in all stages of life. That also means in the traumatic stages, that God is not absent from somebody's pain, or that evil is out of control and death is just happening and is random. But here we see it's very clear in those verses, which are many in the Quran, that the Quran says, and God will surely test you with a touch of fear and hunger and the loss of wealth and lives and fruits, but give good tidings to the patient. Now it's a very challenging passage, because here we are introduced with a God who will test us with things that are really painful, are really uncomfortable, are sad, are catastrophic. God will test you with a touch of fear and hunger and the loss of wealth and lives. So throughout the Quran, we are introduced with a God who is compassionate and caring and loving and forgiving and kind, but then also a God who challenges us, who wants us to be in the fire, in the spiritual fire, who molds us and shapes us and tests us and puts us willingly into distress to enable some growth and enable some transformation. And even though the human beings resist, right? Because who wants to be in a painful situation? Who wants to experience sickness and illness and pain and death and devastation? Still, those passages hold their ground. And Muslims affirm that everything, right? Everything, the good and the bad, the sad and the joyful, are all from God. Now, here are other verses that really were comforting to me as I was going through my own grief. He is the one who makes you laugh and weep. God is the one who makes you laugh and cry. So there seems to be, we are introduced to this lunar spirituality. It's not all sunshine and happiness. And this is a God who sometimes puts you into a position of sadness and pain and distress, and for a wisdom that is sometimes beyond human comprehension. But there's also good news here, that anything is surmountable. Give good news to the patient, that whatever you are facing, whatever human tragedy we are facing, that it's still possible to come out of it beautified, strengthened, transformed, shaped, spiritually matured, elevated. And like I said earlier, if you understand how we situate death in the nature of this life, what is this life for? This life is not about absolute happiness. That's not how the Quran introduces itself. It actually doesn't fool the reader. It says this world is not a place of absolute happiness. You will not get it all. It doesn't fool the reader. It says this is a place of transformation, of growth and learning. And sometimes that growth is painful. Sometimes change is painful. Sometimes transformation is painful. There's something what we call post-traumatic growth in psychology, that sometimes we are especially growing in our most painful moments in life. I think many of us can relate to that, that the most transformative experiences, the deepest awakenings and enlightenments we have in moments of trauma and sadness and pain and illness and feeling utterly vulnerable and desperate. And so this is when the Quran talks about a God who is in charge of good and evil, that it does not allow for human beings to put God in a box or assign things that are perceived as evil to other causes or other powers or evil forces. There is no notion like that. It's absolute oneness. Everything that we experience as distress is also in absolute control and rests in the foreknowledge of God. So here we see, when I am ill, he is the one who cures me. So it's this complementary idea of God being the God of mercy and kindness and love and forgiveness and blessings, but also we are introduced to a God who has sovereignty, authority, who sometimes puts us willingly into a moment for transformational growth. And so this is how Muslims come to understand the nature of this world and how death is also positioned. Another theme that is throughout the Quran is echoed is that death is universal. Every soul will taste death. And again, we have it here in this passage. We test you with evil, and God tests you with evil and with good as trial. And to us you will be returned. Again, this theme of this earth, this world as being a place of growth and learning and change and evolution and transformation through the good and the bad, right, is always reiterated in the Quran. And death and mortality are hovering over the human being to make them aware that time is limited, that life is a limited, beautiful gift and trust, and to make good use of it, to invest themselves fully, be mindful, be in the moment, be grateful, be conscious, and try to strive to our best potential. Every soul will taste death, and you will only be given your full compensation on the day of resurrection. So the idea is that, right, this world, this life is transitory. Death is not the end. There will be a return to that divine home, to the source of life. And then again, so when their time comes, they will not remain behind an hour, nor will they precede it. So that timing of death, life and death, is divinely timed. It's not something that we can negotiate, that we can delay, that we can escape, that we can, avoid. And this is also something that gives Muslims a lot of peace and acceptance, because guilt is a very real reality. I mean, it's a strong reality, especially in grief, and guilting ourselves into, I could have done this, and what if this happened, and trying to, recreate and rewrite a new story. But the Quran says it's not in your hand, right? Regardless the circumstances, God is an ultimate charge of this final, timing, and it's not something that can be negotiated or escaped or delayed. It's part of the divine plan. The timing and the location is very much affirmed by Muslims. Another, again, theme that comes throughout the Quran is death is inevitable, and the agony of death will bring the truth. That is what you were trying to avoid. Human beings want to avoid death. They want to delay death. They want to not talk about it. They want to, avoid it by all costs. Like I said earlier, it's very much something that is not welcome to talk about, right? So human beings try to distract themselves, divert themselves, and this is something that the Quran criticizes and challenges, that face your human mortality, be prepared. You are leaving every day. You are a migratory being. Migration is key to your spiritual identity. The moment is all what you have, and try to make the best out of it. Live your life to the fullest. Invest yourself in good causes. Make the moment count. And this is, I think, what mortality also brings, that life-giving, that creative element, that not to avoid it, but to face it with courage and bravery, and to say, this is my ultimate reality and destination, and I cannot avoid it. And so over and over, the Quran criticizes those that they're trying, people who are trying to flee from death. Indeed, the death from which you flee, indeed, it will meet you. Then you will be returned to the knower of the unseen and the witnessed, and he will inform you about what you used to do. So this idea of that death is a return is something that feels very comforting to Muslims, very soothing, that it's not the ultimate end, that death is a transition to the afterlife, that death is a gateway to our return to our final home. And it's also something that is a very strong belief and affirmation in the Islamic tradition. The last verse here, wherever you may be, death will overtake you, even if you should be within towers of lofty construction. But if good comes to them, they say, this is from God, right? I talked about this lunar spirituality. When good things happen to us, we say, this is from God, a loving God, a caring God, a compassionate God. But if evil befalls them, they say, this is from you. They blame, people blame causes, blame themselves, or assign it to themselves. But a believer, a Muslim believer, is called to say, both have been destined by God. So what is the matter with those people that they can hardly understand any statement? Quite interesting. Quran doesn't allow for compartmentalization of God. You have to accept the full package. God is in absolute control of everything, regardless of the circumstances. Now, important to stress here, the Quran does not negate human action or human free will. It always operates with both ends. God is an ultimate foreknowledge, but it doesn't take away from human free will. You will not find Muslims being in a fatalistic state saying, everything is destiny, I have no say. Quite the contrary, I'm fully responsible for my actions, for my undertakings, and I will be fully accountable and held accountable by God on Judgment Day. So this world is important. Human choices matter. And at the same time, there is the Quranic affirmation that ultimately God is in control. God has the final say over things. And if God allows for certain things to happen, that they're always operating within the divine framework of beauty, wisdom, and compassion. God is not there to, according to the Quran, to come and punish someone, to get them, or to torture them. It always starts with every chapter in the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. And some of the virtues that are related in that context is ultimate trust. You don't know, but the Quran calls Muslims to trust, to have full trust that wisdom and mercy are still operating, even if it's not always evident in the first place. And that's where faith comes in. Islam and being Muslim means absolute devotion, absolute surrender and submission, giving yourself fully into the divine hands and trusting that everything has been taken care of. And I think especially with the issue of bereavement and grief, this is something that feels quite healing and comforting, knowing that it's not in your hands, right? It's not in your hands. It's not in the hands of any causes. At the same time, human beings are full agents and they have autonomy and have to make choices. So it's, like I said, it's a both and, which is affirmed here. So to summarize, before we go into the small group, number one important thing that I hope that each one of us will take away, that death is a creation of God. Mortality is by divine design. Death is part of the divine plan. It's not an accident. It's not random. It's not just a coincidence, because that takes all away from the idea of radical monotheism. That's very important to keep in mind, that the oneness of God in the Quran needs to be preserved at all costs. And this is, I think, something difficult because we perceive death as so devastating and destructive, that we can't imagine that a merciful and compassionate God is sending us something so evil. But this is a very subjective definition from a Quranic perspective, because what constitutes evil? Now, according to the Islamic tradition, a child that dies before puberty, my own child, enters heaven directly. Now, from my daughter's perspective, is what she experienced evil? From my perspective, yes. If I look from the worldly perspective, from my self-centered perspective, her death is absolutely horrific, absolutely tragic, and something that I do not desire or will or wish on anybody. But from the other worldly dimension, from the invisible dimension of the afterlife, her death was nothing but beautiful, nothing but merciful. And so this is a very, very important concept. And I hope for next week, as you listen to Imam Sohaib Sultan, who really engages this topic, a very dear friend of mine, a dear brother in faith who died of cancer, who addresses this topic of what is even evil, right? How do we define what is evil? From our worldly perspective, a lot of things look evil to us, yes. But if this world is all there is, absolutely it's unjust and evil and suffering and pain. But death is situated in a larger divine framework, which invites the Muslim to take account of this world, but also the other world, and try to, try to make sense of the events and happenings in the world from a dual dimensional perspective. From a Quranic perspective, death has life-giving elements. Mortality deepens quality of life and brings out the best in humans. You will see people who go through very traumatic death experiences, that they often take it as a very important moment to reconsider their priorities, huge moments of awakening, huge moments of transformation, deep qualitative moments of elevation, spiritual change. There's so much that's happening through that one traumatic death experience, but it doesn't have to be all negative, right? So the Quran says mortality is there to bring out the best in human beings. Death is not glorified. Death is not never asked for. Death should not be desired. But when it comes, it also doesn't come just with negative experiences. It also has something to offer, right, as an opportunity. Death is a natural part of life that should be embraced and integrated. And we will see next week how death awareness is integrated into Muslim life. Death is a universal experience, even though each person will experience death in uniquely different ways. Not one person dies in the same way like the other person. Each death is unique, while at the same time, death is universal, which also is comforting, because it's not just your own experience, right? It's a walk, like I said, it's a destination, a journey of humankind, that every human being is on the same journey, a migratory being, and moving into a certain direction. Death is inevitable. The Quran doesn't assign death to any human being, or gives power over the decision of death to any human being or causes. It's very important because of this idea of radical monotheism. Death, the Quran criticizes, is avoided and denied, which is not healthy, because facing mortality, like mentioned is an important life-giving element. It keeps a person conscious and mindful, fully present, deepens the quality of life. Time and place of death is destined by God alone. And death is not the end, it's a transition to the afterlife, which is very strongly echoed in the Quran. Fear of death is natural and healthy in moderation. Like I said, a little bit fear of death is a good thing. Too much of it becomes debilitating and paralyzing. And something that is important, even with all this death talk, is death is never glorified. It's prohibited to ask for death or desire death. There's a very strong language in the tradition to preserve death at all, costs. And this worldly life is just as important as the afterlife because of the fact that it's a plowing field for the hereafter, that it's trying to invite human beings to make a good investment. They're bringing their best selves into this worldly life. So now it's your turn to share a little bit about how you orient yourself. I mean, after you listen to this Quranic portrayal and the Quranic theology of death and dying that informs Muslim beliefs. And I want to also say, while this is, of course, the Quranic theology of death, that each Muslim is on their own spiritual journey, right? We still need to do the work and communicate and ask questions because each of us has a different level of commitment. Not every Muslim, depending on their own background and their own experiences and views, comes to this in the same way. So it's very human because of our complexity and our own personal contexts and histories that we come to this in different ways. But at least, like I said in the beginning, this still gives Muslims a shared orientation, a shared religious and holy sacred vocabulary, and it is the central authority that invites Muslims to enhance and examine their own views. So this is where I invite you as we go into the small groups and just briefly introduce yourself and maybe your religious or non-religious background. And how does your own personal view compare to the Quranic understanding? Where do you agree, disagree? Where do you see yourself mirrored? And that's where I hope we'll have a little bit of an interreligious conversation. So checking the time. So it's 8:10. So maybe we'll come back in 15 minutes and then do a little bit of sharing. Welcome back. I think the Zoom magic has happened, and I hope you had a nice conversation, some good group reflection. We have a few minutes left, and maybe if you could use your Slido QR code again and share with me and with the audience, what is one thing you learned today? Or maybe also one thing that you was something that was not really apparent to you, something that was entirely new to you. If you could share that, that would be so appreciated. Let's give some time. And then also, if you have lingering questions, like I said before, you're welcome to submit those, and I'll make sure to go through those questions with my team, and I hope to address them and answer them the best way I can. I also want to just stress that I'm not a mental health professional. I'm not a grief expert. I'm not, I do not come to this topic from the perspective of these. I very much respect expertise. I come to this as a Muslim theologian. I'm really passionate about Islamic theology and spirituality. And somebody asked me earlier in the question, how did you find comfort in your faith after your child died? And this is really one of the terms that the Quran gives itself is shifa. Muslims very much affirm the Quran as a scripture of healing, that it's provided cure in distressing moments. And so in the very early weeks and throughout my life, this is where I turn to, really the Quran and its scriptural content and its healing content gave me really an orientation. It's my map and how I orient myself in the world. And actually, when I was in the hospital, healthcare professionals asked me when I, taking the MRI and when I was literally, disabled for a long period of time, what would help you? I said, please, I just want to hear and listen to Quranic recitation. A lot of Muslim patients find great healing and comfort listening to the Quranic recitation. Reading the translation, reading Quran is really affirmed as a type of psychological medicine, as a soothing and healing. So I would suggest, especially for those who are caring and offering support to Muslim patients, have a Quran app, a couple of Quran hard copies on in the hospital. If it's helpful, their family and support system can recite to them. But I found very much a lot of wisdom and comfort in the Quranic words, and a lot of Muslims actually see the Quran as shifa, as healing, and as as support in those times of crisis. And we have somebody here sharing, reading Quran has been incredibly therapeutic for me, right? And what somebody says, I've learned that how death points to God as the giver of life, illness points to God as a healer, hunger points to God as a provider. All challenges bring us to a greater knowledge and consciousness of God, right? And so I think situating death, it's really important to situate it into this larger framework, how to understand this worldly life, and not to see it as isolation. What's the purpose of this life? If this purpose is absolute happiness and joy, we all know and look around us, it's not there. Everybody goes through struggles and tragedies and experiences hardship and trials. But what is the purpose and meaning in all of this? And so for the Quran, it is really spiritual growth. Physically, we are grown. That's finished. That's finalized. There's no more growth to physical growth. But how do you bring somebody to grow intellectually, morally, spiritually, and emotionally? And this is where mortality and suffering and pain comes in to really test. And I don't want to ever minimize the pain or somehow beautify the pain. Death is not a beautiful experience. Death is horrific. I'm saying this as a grieving mother. Right? Grief is nothing. Nothing can fix that pain. Nothing can cure that heartbreak. And this is something that comes to Muslims as something that you need to accept, right? Because there is no cure for that type of sadness and that type of pain that you have to endure until the rest of your worldly life. So there's very much also that is where Muslims, I think, coming from, which I have seen echoed in all the visits that people have offered to me, the support, all the Quranic content and messaging was in that framework. I will make sure to go through all these beautiful submissions and all your thoughts, and I would love to take time to think about it more deeply. But I want to thank you so much for joining me for this first session, and I hope you find it beneficial in many ways. And I hope to continue the conversation with you and to explore with you together themes about mortality and death and dying. I hope to see you next week, and have a wonderful rest of your week and be well. And thank you so much.